Good afternoon, everyone. Today I thought I'd just review the process of a little project I did last fall, which involved the building of what's known as a foldable sawbuck. Foldable sawbuck is this structure here, and it's called foldable because it folds. Here we're in the folded state, and here it's unfolded. And as you can see, it consists of three leg segments, here, here, and here, these cross members, and then some side strapping. And its purpose is to hold firewood, to make it easier to saw the firewood or buck the firewood, hence the name sawbuck. Saw the firewood off the end here. So this stick here might represent a trunk of a tree, maybe 4 to 5 inches in diameter, and you would just simply move it down as you cut chunks off it. You can also cut between these leg segments here. Anyhow, this video is to show you the process of building one of these. The sawbuck that I'm building today basically consists of all the same wood. It's 2 by 4 by 8 feet long, which have been cut in half. So you need 5 2 by 4 8-footers to make this structure, and then you'll be cutting them in half to make them 4 feet long. And then you'll also need 3 4-inch long, 1/2 inch wide carriage bolts with nuts and washers to assemble the legs here. And then for the side strapping, I basically put those on using deck screws. You can use outdoor construction screws as well. 3 inches long is a good one. That gives a good amount of adhesion. And the following video just shows how I go about building it and how you go about using them. Okay, I'm just going to cut these 2 by 4s in half, 48 inches. Okay, now I'm going to put the 30-degree angle on the bottom of each of the feet. And there you go. There's 5 more of those now. Okay, now to figure out where we're going to place the hole in the cross members. I've seen anywhere from 14 to 18 inches sort of recommended online. I've done a bit of a test here with a tape measure, and I think for me, I want the hole brought down from the top to about 16 inches. So that's basically a third of the length of the board. So you want this section up here to be shorter. You want the bottom section to be wider because it needs the wider stance to be stable, and yet still enough width here to hold some decent sized wood. So that's what you're really aiming for, just to get that area here big enough and to have the bottom big enough. Okay, 16 inches down from the top of the leg. And then the center of a 2 by 4 is 1 3/4 inches. Okay, I've got all the pieces of 2 by 4 marked for their holes. I'm using a 1/2 inch spade bit since I've got 1/2 inch bolts. If you're using 5/8 bolts, then you'll need a 5/8 spade bit or another type of drill just to match the size of the bolt. Anyhow, here we go. Line it up with the cross. So before you bolt them together, make sure the angled feet are pointed in opposite directions, because as they spread out, that's how they will have to work on those specific angles. So here are my 3 leg units bolted together. So now I'll cut the 2x4s for the side straps in half, and then I'll start screwing those together onto the legs. It's actually a fairly simple project. There's not much to it. So I've come out to this more open floor space just to lay out the pieces here to get a better sense of the measurements and whatnot. So I've got the tops of the legs up at this end, and I've drawn horizontal line across each of the leg segments. Now I've put it at 18 inches. I'm not sure if that's going to be too far down. Maybe it should be closer to the hinge point. But I'll try this, and I may have to change it. So I placed my initial horizontal line here at 18 inches down from the top, and I think that was going to be too low. So I've brought it up to 17 inches now. Also, I had screwed this board onto the wrong boards. I had them all onto the same direction of feet, but I put them on the wrong feet. So you got to be sure at the foot end that what you're screwing this board to, which will flip up this way, has the feet in the right direction to be on the ground this way, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so I think that looks great. It's got a good wide stance, and it still has quite a bit of room up here in the top of the X. So I'll strap the other side on at the same level, and then do the 2 bottom pieces that just add a bit of stability. So it'll be a lot easier screwing this side on because everything's together now. I just basically have to make sure I screw it onto the right pieces. Yeah, so I reverted to some 3-inch deck screws. They're a little more appropriate, I think. Those other ones I was putting in were way too long and too wide. Not so much too long, but too wide. All right, there it is. I got them in the right legs. If you get them in the wrong legs, they don't work. So now I'll just put the bottom strap pieces on and we're basically done. So there we go. I got the side pieces all screwed on now. This lower piece, I put the top of it 18 inches below the bottom of the top one. If you ever want to sort of put your foot on it to steady it a bit more if you needed to. I don't know if you'll need to, but it also provides obviously a lot of structural torsional strength in the lower end, which would be more free to flex if you didn't have this down. I thought being a bit further down than up here, some people put an extra slat here, which could be useful, I guess, but I think it's more use down here myself. Okay, here we are with the finished sawbuck out in its natural habitat by the woodshed. I just thought I'd show everyone how to use it. So as I mentioned before, these leg structures are forming an X on the top that holds the log in place. Very simple. And typically you would just be cutting off from the end here. So you always want to be cognizant of the end you're on so you can get the chainsaw as close as possible to the sawbuck. Now this is a cedar post, which I wasn't really planning to cut up for firewood. It was just an old cedar post from our fence line, had a bit of rod on the end, so I've cut that off. And now I just might use this for something else, maybe in the gardens or something. Here's another one with some rod on it from when it rotted in the ground. I'll just cut that off, and the other end has a bit of rot too. So here's one of the long, skinny, young birch trees that I cut from my clearing area that I just did. As you can see, this stretches right across and off the length of the sawbuck. So I'm just going to saw this end off first over here, and then do the rest of the cuts on that end. Again, I want to keep my saw blade as close as possible to the sawbuck if you're cutting it off. There we go. Now I can just come down this end. Now here you can see what happens is they get to a shortness where they won't rest really well in here, and that's where they become more of a trick to cut again. And actually, when I used to have one years ago, before it got destroyed or rotted away or whatever, I think it was more useful, this item, for when I was using bow saws or other saws to cut the wood. And I say that because with these kinds of saws, you're basically using one hand for the cutting motion and one hand for the steadying of the object. So you basically proceed like this. So where I used this originally in the past was when I had larger limbs, for example, that I was cutting off trees, or we'd often get smaller trees falling down across certain parts of the property here, and I might cut the trees up in sections and bring them back and then cut them up into smaller pieces for firewood on this device. And that's where this sawbuck is most useful. So it's not a perfect tool by any means, but it is a handy thing to have just to hold these shorter, narrower logs, not huge logs, but as I mentioned earlier, maybe up to 8 or 9 inches in diameter, depending how long they are, obviously, and how much you can lift easily without breaking your back. So anyhow, it does make the job easier just to move the log along here and cut it, as opposed to trying to do it on the ground, getting your saw blade into the dirt and the stones. And this keeps it at a nice level so you don't have to be bent over all the time. So if you have all your logs piled over here, for example, if you've had them brought to your house by another supplier, for example, like a lot of people do, you can simply shunt the logs onto here, cut them up, and then move down the line. So there certainly are limitations of this tool, and I've found as I've gotten more into chainsaw work with the battery powered chainsaw out in our forest here that typically I'm cutting wood on site. So I'm only cutting basically trees that have fallen down because they've died and are still in good shape as far as the wood that hasn't rotted yet. So I'm cutting right from the smaller branches down to the larger wood right on site, and I'm bucking it there too. So I'm not typically bringing back longer things that I would put in here. Now there is occasional times when I'll maybe do that. I may bring back 8-foot lengths of branches that may range from 2 to 4 inches or something like that, but typically I'm doing that on site, even though it does mean being bent over a lot. I'm typically only out there for an hour or an hour and a half at a time anyhow before the batteries on the chainsaws start to wane. And by then I've felt like I've done enough for that day anyhow. I just do an hour to an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at a time. And that's enough, and then I'll maybe go back another day or two after that, or 3 or whatever, and before long I've got a decent pile of wood. So the usefulness of this item is somewhat debatable, I guess, but I think they are valuable to have on hand, and they're very simple to build. All of these materials were probably $60 or less, and I know in the States it would be even cheaper. So for an hour or a couple hours time building it, and relatively inexpensive. It's kind of a nice tool to have out in your shed for those times when you may just want to put longer pieces of wood in here and cut them off. And of course, the thing that's nice about this sawbuck design is that it folds up. So when you're done with it, just fold it up and hang it up somewhere. I haven't got a hanger for it yet myself, but for now I'm just putting it here beside the woodshed. I'll get it hung up in the tractor shed probably and keep it out of the weather. This one I just built out of typical 2x4, non-pressure treated. If you want to keep it a little longer lasting, you could make it out of pressure treated, or like me, I'm just going to hang it up inside another shed, so it should stay fine like that, as long as it's not sitting out in the weather every day. Anyhow, there you go. Do-it-yourself foldable sawbuck.